All right, we're live. Hi, Piers. How are you? Well, we're not live. We're being recorded.
Sure.
How are you,
I'm
mate?
good. How are you? I'm good.
Yeah,
How are you?
I'm really good. I'm really good. It's been just over a year since we spoke. It's been about 13, 14 months. That went by quick, didn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's been quite a year, hasn't it?
Yeah,
It's been a very difficult
nothing
year,
really's
actually.
happened in between, has it? It's been a bit of a slow year.
Yeah, I think we all need a holiday.
Yeah, we really do. We really do.
We could go
How are you,
anywhere.
first of all? Are you well?
Yeah, I'm well, thank you. Yes.
Good,
Busy, as everybody is.
good.
But yes, I'm well.
Good. I wanted to talk to you, Piers, because it's been a year on since you came on. And I wanted to talk mainly about, it's about Syria, isn't it? And Douma that we're talking
Yes.
that really we need to focus on here. And what happened was it 2018, February, March 2018?
2018, yeah.
April the 7th, was it? Is that the
April the
date?
7th was when the alleged chemical attack happened in Douma, yeah.
So this is almost exactly 3 years ago
Yeah.
at the
Yes.
time of recording this. Now, if I remember right, I'll set this up for you and you fill in the gaps. If I remember
Okay.
right, about 10 days previous to this, Donald Trump had said he was pulling troops out of Syria, correct? He was pulling troops out of the area. And then about 10 days later in Douma, what our media were calling moderate rebels were surrounded in Douma in Syria by Syrian and I think Russian forces. And they were given an option to put down their weapons and sod off back to where they came, or, they were going to go in and capture them. Now, basically the war is won at this stage, isn't it? Assad is winning the war. The Russians have helped him. And am I correct in assuming if a chemical weapon happens at that stage, it's pretty much the worst thing that Assad could happen at that stage, because it brings the weight of three or four superpowers down upon him right at the point where he's due to win the war.
Yeah, that's broadly speaking correct. And that was actually pointed out by Lord Admiral West and another British military commander at the time on the news, that it would be extremely irrational for such an attack to occur at that point. It would make no sense militarily from the point of view of Assad. So yes, that analysis is correct and was stated at the time.
Okay, that was Lord
It
Admiral
makes a little
West.
sense.
That's Lord Admiral, first Sea Lord Admiral West, I think his full title is, which is, I'll get to him in a minute. But I just want to, as a standalone podcast, just to make sure people, are aware of everything that went on. So the moderate rebels, I believe, were the moderate rebels. I should put them in quotes, shouldn't I? They were in Douma at that time. They were a faction called Jaish al-Islam, according to the reports I've seen. Do you know who Jaish al-Islam are at all, Piers?
Well, they're one of the groups in Syria which has been opposed, trying to overthrow the Syrian government.
So were they Syrians?
Yes.
Okay. And who's funding them? Where do they get their
Well,
weapons?
the support, I mean, the support going into opposition groups in Syria is a complex, but I mean, broadly speaking, an alliance of countries, UK, France, US, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and I think Israel is somewhere there in the background, have provided support to groups trying to overthrow the Syrian government, and sort of indirectly, directly, and so on, into that complex array of groups trying to overthrow the Syrian government. Support going to them. I mean, it is a matter of record. I think an Ian Cobain scoop in The Guardian several years ago identified that Incostrat, part of the FCO Stratcom, strategic communication operation in Syria, was providing support to Jaish al-Islam, and The Guardian reported that back in 2016, I think, when the documents came out. So those links are reasonably well established, I think, between the UK and Jaish al-Islam. More broadly, yes, you have a number of countries which I listed trying to overthrow the Syrian government, pouring in various forms of support to try and get help those groups overthrow the government.
So it's fair to say that Western countries who don't like Syria would necessarily, they wouldn't have minded that Jaish al-Islam were fighting Syria.
Oh,
Is that fair to
there is
say?
no, there is no question that there is no question that the empirical record is very clear now, and it's not disputed that Western governments have been supporting a variety of groups, some of whom we would define ourselves as extremist or terrorist.
Some of whom we have called terrorists when we've been fighting them in years past. These same people, we've called them terrorists, and then we call them moderate rebels when they're on the side that we like.
Yeah, if you listen to sort of Tulsi Gabbard, the former congresswoman for Hawaii, who was a presidential candidate, I mean, the terms that she uses is that the West has been involved in supporting Al-Qaeda linked group, Al-Nusra Front, Jaish al-Islam, but she kind of describes it in general terms of essentially Al-Qaeda linked groups are some of the groups we've been supporting. So that would fit with what you've just said, that we're supporting, in a sense, the very groups or groups connected to organizations which we have claimed under the rubric of the global war on terror that we claim to be fighting. Yes, and that's, you know, that's a criticism that this is not sort of in the realms of, as it were, disputed conspiracy theory. This is fairly well established now for anyone who honestly talks about Syria. And so, I mean, other American academics, Max Abrams, for example, and also Jeffrey Sachs, although he hasn't talked about the groups, but he's made it very clear that the West has been involved, or America has been involved in an illegal covert war. He mentioned Timber Sycamore, which was the covert operation between the US and Saudi Arabia. So there is no doubt, this is what's been going on. We've been backing these groups, and it's definitely been the case. And this is obviously a huge problem for Western governments, in a sense, in terms of the legality of that.
I mean, we haven't declared war on Syria, have we, Piers? And as far as I'm aware, neither of America. They haven't got congressional approval for any war and regime change in Syria. This is illegal, isn't it?
Broadly speaking, yes, it would be described as a form of an act of primary aggression. Not this, you know, whatever the complexities of the Syrian war, that has been going on. It is indeed a fact.
This has been going on since how long? 2011, 2012, it started, this so-called Arab Spring that rose up?
Well, it's certainly the case that intelligence documents which have come out certainly indicated from 2012 onwards, there was certainly this support for groups, and there was awareness that some of these groups were what you describe as extremist. In terms of how how it started, I mean, it's there is controversy. Some people argue that there was a genuine democratic uprising which was then crushed, and then external intervention occurred. Others argued that, in fact, there were demonstrations against the government, but they were hijacked or exploited by elements which were ready to try to overthrow the Syrian government.
That's what I heard as well, that it was sort of semi-organic, this uprising, because it wasn't just in Syria, it was all over, you know, Libya was the same as well at the time. And it just seemed to me like it was sort of hijacked almost. You know?
Well, it's interesting. If we've had this conversation before, if you go back to the Chilcot report and the documents in section 3.1, I think it is, where you have Tony Blair talking with George Bush about how to take out Saddam. One of Tony Blair's bullet points is that we can, you know, you tighten up sanctions, you back groups, you wait for the uprisings to start, and then you back them militarily. So it would be reasonable to speculate that might well have been what was going on in the case.
Yeah, you're not exactly at war with them. You've just started a war.
Yes, you're taking advantage of internal unrest, and you're then leaping in. And some, I know that one, I think a French scholar has investigative journalist has written a book, and he has argued, as I understand it, that for example, UK and MI6 operations were kind of running Timber Sycamore before the Americans really took the lead. So the Americans sort of led it, I think, 2012 later onwards, but at 2011 it was sort of MI6. And of course, the French former foreign minister has said in public on a TV station that he was approached by UK intelligence in 2009 saying, do you want to get involved in something we're cooking up in Syria? So I think that those are all legitimate questions for the historians to ask: is how did this start? Who were the players? Who were the manipulators, and so on? right at the start of it.
Tony Blair.
But certainly by 2012, there was a powerful, external drive to back groups to overthrow.
It didn't just happen overnight, I think, is what you're trying to say, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, yeah, of course, and Syria was on the target list after 9/11. It's named.
It was one of the 7 countries that Wesley Clark mentioned, wasn't it?
Yeah, and so, the documents, yeah.
3 years ago, almost 3 years ago, this is April, I think it's April the 7th, correct me if I'm wrong, we hear reports of a chemical weapons attack in Douma. Now, you're part of the working group on the Syria working group on propaganda and media in Syria. Am I saying?
Yeah, work group Syria propaganda and media. Yeah.
And correct me if I'm right, but you're a doctor in propaganda studies.
At the time I set it up, I was a professor at Sheffield.
So if anybody's going to know if this is a propaganda construct it's going to be you, isn't it, Doctor?
Well, it is true that for the last 10 years of my academic life, I've been studying propaganda, and I'd looked at the propaganda surrounding Iraq and WMD. But yeah, if you look at my publication lists, in the last 6-7 years, it's been looking at propaganda. So, I mean, I would say, it doesn't mean that I'm an all-knowing expert, but it knows that I have some understanding of what might be a propaganda operation.
You can see what I'm doing there. You can see I'm setting the scene, and I'm setting the scene that this is what's happened. This is what the two sides are saying, and this is an expert talking on the subject. Okay, this is all I'm trying to do, Piers. I have not got a dog in this hunt. I really haven't. All I want to do is find out the truth, and the truth is that we heard this chemical weapons attack had happened in Douma. I, for one, immediately, if you go back and look at my video, I've got a picture of the bed with the gas canister on that apparently did this. And I had no problems, and I'm very careful with my titles, but I had no problems. Obvious false flag I put on there. Obvious false flag. Because it made no sense at all for Assad to do this. None. In fact, I would go so far as to say it would be the most stupid thing that he could do at that time. And as far as I'm aware, he was educated partly in this country. So he's not a stupid man, I don't think. So it made no sense for me to go along with it. And then people like yourself and reporters such as Vanessa Beeley, who I'm going to reach out and I want to talk to about this, started sending reports back from the ground, and everything, all the narratives that they had told us, there were holes all over them, weren't they? Now, in our last video, we went over some of these. So can you just list a few of the questions that need to be answered with regards to what happened in Douma? And I know that you've faced another attack from the BBC, you and Vanessa recently, and the working group, but I just want to, there are lots of questions about this Douma that haven't been answered, and also seemingly the media don't want to ask either, do they?
Okay, I mean, to give an accurate
just a quick
possible, and just in a couple of minutes. I mean, yes, there was controversy when the attack happened, because it seemed to be, why would the Syrian government do that? So it was immediately controversy. There was immediately controversy because the Russian Federation said that they had witnesses, and they took the witnesses to The Hague, who said that the hospital scenes were staged. And so there was doubt at the time. I think the more important part of the history of this is that US, France, and Britain bombed within 7 days. They bombed on the 14th. That's when we were on the front page of the Times, being attacked for even asking a question. But then the OPCW team got in on the ground and started doing their investigation. And by June 2018, they had drafted an interim report, which had raised a whole series of questions. And that is when you have the start of the OPCW controversy, because what happened with the team who went into Douma was that they came out and they had a lot of questions. They had a lot of questions about cylinders, as you pointed out.
So
they had a lot of questions.
Just to stop you, Piers, the OPCW, this is the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. This is the global authority on chemical weapons attacks, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
This is there is no other, this is as high as it goes.
Yeah, they're expected to be the independent assessors of such events.
Okay.
Now, so the team of inspectors who went into Douma came back, went back to their headquarters in The Hague, and they drafted an interim report. And the issues that were raised were the question of the cylinders. They did not appear to be damaged sufficiently to have caused a damage on the roof. There was a very big question about how 50 civilians had been killed by gas from a chlorine cylinder leaking down into a stairwell where there were broken windows, because all the casualties seemed to collapse on the spot on top of each other. The questions about that, there were questions about witness testimony, widely divergent witness testimony as to what had happened, and inconsistencies in witness testimony. And so that's what the team wrote in their original interim report. And then, and this wasn't public at this point, but then what happened was that interim report was ready to go out with a lot of serious question about, has anything really happened here? Has an attack occurred? And then somebody inside the OPCW secretly changed the report and tried to publish it, and secretly modified and doctored it, removed the questions which were being raised about toxicology and witnesses, and then exaggerated some of the findings to suggest an attack had occurred.
How do we know
and that would have become the original interim report if it wasn't for the case that one of the Douma team discovered that it had been changed, and then there was an internal protest, an argument over what had happened, and that then triggered sort of a chain of events within the OPCW, and with OPCW scientists, whistleblowers starting to speak out in various ways. And so, and then to come back to, in the sense, the question you asked, so the team getting on the ground on Douma, they look, they see, and there's a lot of problems, a lot of anomalies. They go back, they write an interim report, and then somebody comes in and tries to change it in secret, and that causes obviously a bust up, and that was the start of the OPCW controversy. But those were the kind of key issues. You said, well, what were the doubts? The key questions are: the damage to the cylinders doesn't make sense. There's the cylinder on the bed, which is several meters from the hole in the ceiling. So how did it move across the room? The toxicology is very important. How did 50 civilians suddenly collapse all at once and die on the spot?
Open windows in the stairwells. Chlorine doesn't, if I'm correct, if I remember right, we've talked about this. Chlorine kills about 15% of people in a normal exposure, but then it killed everybody in this attack, apparently. Yes, and there was no signs of them trying to run away.
And a team of NATO toxicologists who looked at images and witness testimony reported to the Douma team that chlorine did not kill these people. That toxicology briefing was erased, as it were, from the record come the final report. So that's one of the controversies. But they were very clear that chlorine didn't kill these people. So you had these very sort of clear scientific issues or analytical issues on the incident at Douma, which suggested that there was a very real possibility the attack didn't occur at all. And that was all internal to the OPCW. Of course, out there, we've had people such as Riyam Dalati, the BBC producer, stating in public that after 6 months of research, he said the hospital scenes were staged. He didn't say any other parts of it, but he said the hospital scenes were staged. Yeah. And he won't talk about it since then.
I'll come to that in a minute, if you don't mind.
So I think that's the core of the controversy. And then, of course, the OPCW.
So there were lots of questions to be asked. Now, rather than reach out to you, rather than the authorities reach out to you as an expert on this in the field, and I say, what have you found? Can we, get to the bottom of this? They've decided to just smear you instead, haven't they? Some of the things I've heard, I've read about you in the last couple of years is stupid. It really is. It's childish nonsense. They've smeared you, is what they've done.
Yeah.
And they've smeared everybody in the working group of propaganda, Syria working group propaganda and media.
Well, now, just for your viewers, the working group formed in January 2018. We were immediately smeared by the former Guardian journalist Brian Whitaker, just smeared for hit pieces.
Oh, really?
Before we published anything.
Brian Whitaker, he's the guy that Democracy Now! Called on as their expert.
That's correct. Yes, they called him on.
Didn't call you on.
He smeared before we'd even published anything. And then, keep in mind, the Times attack, a front page attack on me and other members of the working group, 3 other articles, including an editorial, essentially suggesting we should be fired. That published on the day we were bombing Syria in response to Douma. Since then, the numbers of articles are 20, 30 plus articles, mainly in the Huffington Post and the Times, but also now.
Don't mention his name.
Sorry?
Don't mention his name in the Huffington Post.
Yeah,
Don't
okay.
mention it.
You have a phenomenal, and all accusing you of being a Assad apologist, a Putinist, being a conspiracy theorist. That's of course the main one. You're a conspiracy. That's a term which is always used.
They've attacked you personally, but not your findings, though. Correct? They've never refuted anything you've said about Douma.
Ever presented any serious challenges to the arguments. And of course, it becomes more difficult because at some point OPCW whistleblowers started to speak out and so on. But so they've now been discredited, smeared by some of the same organizations who are smearing us. So what's happening here is that every time anybody asks a question, a serious substantive question, the response is not, well, Piers, I think, yes, I understand your point that the evidence suggests this. They just smear you. It's very crude.
Piers is a Russian propagandist who takes
and this is what's
money
been
from Putin.
done
That's
throughout, going on for 3 years.
So the latest smear, I think we're up to date almost, and I think that's given some good background, isn't it, as to what. Because the latest smear attack and the latest attempt by it was the BBC to cover this up, let's face it, was in their radio, was it Radio 4 or something like that, Mayday? They wrote
Mayday series,
13 episode something or other, and the whole episode was dedicated to Douma in Syria. I won't mention the person's name, although I have written to them, and I will write to them and show them this video and say, have you got any answers to any of these questions that I'm about to ask? But they reached out to you before Mayday aired, wasn't it? They reached out to you, and I think Vanessa, they smeared Vanessa heavily in it. And the first question that they wanted to ask you is, they wanted you to confirm or deny statements, didn't they? And the first one is, can you confirm or deny that none of the members of the working group has expertise in Syria or chemical weapons? Okay, all right, that's fine. That's a fine question. But the next one, can you confirm or deny that members of the working group subscribe to conspiracy theories? I mean, this is not a serious attempt at journalism, is it? This is how can that be a serious attempt at journalism? Asking that, she's not asking anything. With these questions I'm reading, you've kindly sent me this a few days ago that they sent to you. And it's all questions that are just going to lead to them being able to smear you, or whatever you say, they can manipulate it in a way that smears you. They're not trying to get the bottom of what happened here, are they?
They're not serious questions. I mean, the journalist in question was in contact with Professor David Miller in the summer over the series, approaching him.
And Professor David Miller is in the working group as well.
Yes. And it was very clear that they were not interested in really examining at all the issues which had been raised by OPCW scientist whistleblowers. They had a narrative which they had sort of taken from the OPCW officialdom and had then decided that's the line. And there was no serious attempt to look at, we asked them to look at our briefing notes. We asked them to, well, why don't you look at all the documents on WikiLeaks? Why don't you listen to the testimony of one of the whistleblowers, Ian Henderson at the UN Security Council, and start to actually interrogate the information properly? None of that was done. And then finally, my understanding is that in the week before the broadcast of that additional episode on Douma, contact was made with an OPCW whistleblower, and contact was made with Bastani, the first Director General of the OPCW, and then the aired podcast essentially smeared both of them, and said discredited them. So there was no serious attempt to look at this controversy. It was that they had their line, and then at the last minute, just because they were going to smear Bastani in the article, in the podcast, quickly contact him, give him, those kind of questions, give him a right to reply.
So they can say, "Oh, we've reached out."
So there was no
due diligence.
And I think, as the American journalist Aaron Mate's pointed out,
I was just about to ask about questions.
Do you mean there are mistakes made all over the place?
I was just about to come on to him because Alan Marte, this is a journalist who has actually asked questions on this, and this is a journalist, unlike the BBC journalist that we've just been talking about. This is somebody who has been asking questions, and this is somebody who has been asking questions to such a degree that he testified at the United Nations.
Yes, he did.
This is somebody who I personally think is incredible, and somebody who will go down hopefully in history as one of the great journalists, because he's been doing brilliant work on this. I am reaching out to him to hopefully come on this podcast and talk to me about it. I have spoken to Ben at the Grey Zone, and I've got a contact with them, and hopefully Alan can come on and talk to me about, about his angle, because he has sent a load of questions to the BBC based on their Mayday series. Who's like Leon? Like,
that's
he's an expert, isn't he?
Huh? Sorry?
He's an expert, Leon. This Leon, he's an expert who keeps saying but apparently he's the expert that the BBC have found, and all the other experts who were there at the site, they haven't spoken to them. They've spoken to somebody else.
They claim to have an OPCW source, and it might well be OPCW of some shape or form. And it's very interesting, the Leon character, which they use. Because
he likes saying doesn't he?
Yeah, he likes saying but also the arguments that are made are very similar to the arguments that you see in the Bellingcat leak letter, which occurred several weeks before, which, as we know, transpired it was false information that Bellingcat published. And so the question is there some kind of OPCW source who's feeding information out to Bellingcat, feeding information out to the BBC, specifically designed to discredit the scientists on the team who have raised questions? And it certainly looks that way, and I think that point that Aaron has made. But it's very unclear who this OPCW source was. And it is interesting that when there's a later BBC News report summary of the Mayday series, which came out about a month ago, that Leon source has disappeared.
Really?
So, and we don't know why the editorial team decided that for the pages of BBC News reports.
I shall ask. I shall ask them. I'm sending them an email anyway, so I shall ask. What happened to Leon? What did you scrub his testimony?
But the bottom line is you have, rather than a serious attempt to listen to, and of course the OPCW scientists who've spoken up are highly experienced former OPCW scientists, highly experienced, very well respected. So when somebody from an organisation speaks, and of that authority, you should at least listen. What do you have to say? But the BBC have used this alleged source to essentially to smear. And not only the OPCW scientists, but also, of course, Bastani, the first Director General of the OPCW. That's the other mad insanity of all this, is that you have the first Director General of the OPCW appearing at UN meetings and so on, and giving testimony and saying that the organisation must listen to these scientists. These scientists are credible, and they have serious issues about what has gone on in terms of Douma investigation. And for the sake of the organisation, its credibility, you must be listened to. First Director General, the OPCW, is saying this in public, and yet we're being smeared as conspiracy theorists and so on. It's quite remarkable how sort of crude the blocking of reasonable questions is in this situation.
Here's a reasonable question, I think. I read it was on the BBC website. It was, they were talking about a member of the working group. What is it? Paul McKeague, his name? Sorry, Paul McKeague. I think that's his name. And I've only paid this a little bit. I've only read the BBC side of things on this article that they wrote about it. One of my friends, who people will know, he says that, the BBC and these New York Times and what have you, they sort of have, sometimes in their articles, they have the truth, but you have to look at it sideways and through a prism, to actually find out what happened. And I remember reading this article that they'd written on Paul McKeague, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing his name right. And I remember thinking, okay, so this guy is after, this guy in your working group, he's after some information on the CIJA, which is sort of like, they say some sort of court to prosecute Syrians involved in war crimes. And you can fill in this in a minute and as to exactly what it is. But basically what it seems what he was trying to do was he was trying to find out if there were people in positions in the country, in you know, professors and people who've got tenure at universities and whatever, who would, you know, give information away to Russians and tried a sting sort of operation. This is what it looked like to me, and caught one. Caught a little guy who was giving away information to what he thought was a Russian called Ivan. But somehow in the article, Paul's the guilty person here. Have I read that right? Have I got this right? Because, like I say, I've only read the BBC side of things, but it just seems weird the way they wrote it.
Well, it's worth people. Paul McKee has put up a statement on the working group website, explaining what occurred, and his dialogue with what turned out to be somebody from the organisation he was investigating. I mean, no one else was involved in that dialogue, and he's explained what he was doing and the mistakes that he made in that.
Okay.
But the broad thing that has happened with that, and what's, you know, in a sense, the most important thing, is he's been caught in a sting operation, which is being used to discredit him and will continue to be used to discredit him and anyone who's associated with him, as we all have been since the beginning, heavily discredited. But what he was investigating was an organisation which, the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, CIJA. And this is one strand of this attempt to prosecute the Syrian government and groups within the conflict for war crimes. But why Paul was investigating CIJA, and I was along with him and David earlier in the year before we were caught up in other research, was that CIJA is in fact an outgrowth of a UK Stratcom operation, the same operation which you can see emerging into the white helmets as well. So what you have is something which is established for justice and accountability, which sounds great in Syria. And it appears to be independent, but it is in fact connected down to a Western Stratcom program, and also set up by individuals who are clearly closely located to the state, intelligence links, and so on. So it's not really impartial. So Paul was investigating that, and he put questions to the people who are running the organisation, set the organisation up, and they didn't respond to his questions. Instead, they set up this sting operation, which entrapped him.
Okay. All right.
The key thing there is...
I wanted to... Sorry, carry on.
So I mean, I think the controversy with CIJA and the broader controversy surrounding that, all of this attempt for a kind of justice in Syria, is that it's actually really part and parcel of those same governments who are trying to overthrow the Syrian government, that it won't generate genuine international justice. It will just present a very one-sided justice and so on, which of course is not really justice. So it's a huge controversy. And I would say that it's ongoing because other people are looking into this. Other people have looked at CIJA before, and Paul was just one of the people. I think they were particularly scared of Paul because I think that they thought, well, the working group, they received information from OPCW scientists. Maybe somebody's going to start to talk to them about CIJA. So I think they were particularly keen on getting ammunition on Paul McKee. But other people are looking at this, and I have to, I'm not directly involved in it, but other people are looking at the background to CIJA and some of the linked, for example, companies, some of these individuals and the companies that someone who's looking at it was describing to me that one of these guys who's, you know, UK intelligence linked in some shape or form, you know, is setting up multiple companies, and then these companies being closed down again within 12 months before you have to file returns. And I think the number for one of these was setting up 10 companies in a certain time frame, which open up and then it closed down again. So, you know, for any reasonable person would say, well, there's a lot of questions here. And of course, one of the things which attracted, we've got Paul looking, and also David Miller to an extent, looking at the CIJA, was that they were subject to an OLAF investigation, a European fraud investigation, this is a big body which investigates fraud in the European Union. And that inquiry seems to just, after it said some very damning things in public about Syria, the investigation seems to just close down all of a sudden.
Isn't that weird?
So, you know, these are all eminently reasonable, important things to be looking at. And so, you know, I think the big question here, and this is what other people who are sort of pursuing investigation from various quarters into this, is really, well, what is this organization? Who are the people running it? Is this something which will actually generate genuine justice, or is this more about trying to build the regime change narrative that, going back to how we started the conversation, that the only baddie in this war is Assad, and that the West is entirely innocent of any wrongdoing? And certainly if you look at sort of Siege's remit, I mean, there seems to be no attempt to look at French, British, American, Qatari, Saudi Arabia.
No! So it's incredible, isn't it? It's like they have been set up as some sort of court to prosecute Syrians involved in war crimes. Well, I happen to know that there are a lot of Brits and a lot of Americans and a lot of French people who've been involved in war crimes too, especially war crimes such as Abu Ghraib and, I don't know, that video called Collateral Murder. I think those are all war crimes, aren't they? I can't remember anybody being prosecuted at all in America or Britain or France. But I tell you what I do remember, Piers. I remember people being prosecuted who exposed the torture program. John Kiriakou is the only person who was ever being prosecuted in America for the torture program, and he was the one who unwittingly told everybody that it existed. So he's the only person who's prosecuted. So why do we get to prosecute Syrians for alleged war crimes? But the war crimes that we've been committing, not only is there no investigation, Piers, but also because of stuff that's gone through Parliament in the last week or two, well, the last few months, where Keir Starmer just fell over and just lay down and they didn't even vote against it. Now we can't retroactively go out and prosecute people who've been involved in these war crimes, can we? We can't go and do it. Why? Because they passed a law to say, oh, well, if it was longer than 3, 4, 5 years ago, then we can't do it. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think you're correct. Yes. Yeah.
So why is it, again, why are we spending so much time and money investigating Syrian war crimes where they're all the way over there and we're all the way over here? And I don't know whether you've noticed, Piers, but this country isn't doing quite so good at the moment. It's in a bit of a mess. Why are we over in Syria? Because I'll tell you what that is, that's Syria. I don't mind telling you at all. I've seen quite a few of them since I've started doing this. That's an implement of regime change. That's what it is. It's a tool for regime change. And I'm sick of it. Tulsi Gabbard's been talking about this non-stop. You mentioned her earlier. But I want to go back to the grey zone, the reporting that Alan Marte has done. They've done great reporting. This is what, as somebody else, I want to speak to Ben Norton about this at the grey zone as well. I mean, he's on my list. I'm going to get to the bottom of this, mate. But he talks about ARC. Who are ARC?
Yeah, ARC was... what you have back in, I think, around 2011, 2012, you have the creation of these organizations, and ARC is one of them. And what happens is that these become, it's essentially outsourcing a Stratcom operation. So in the good old days, Iraq 2003 and so on, all the intelligence and propaganda was sort of being handled internally. So the dodgy dossier was, that was the Joint Intelligence Committee and so on. So it's now, what you see with Syria is that you see essentially an outsourcing of the operations, the Stratcom operations. And Stratcom doesn't just mean communicating, it means doing things like the white helmets, supporting opposition groups, providing them with PR, etc. But these are effectively outsourced, and you have groups such as ARC and companies being set up, and of course Mayday Rescue grew out of this, which became the white helmets. And you have essentially former military, sometimes intelligence-linked people, but primarily former military people heading these organizations as contractors. It's the contracting out propaganda operations.
Do they just to ask a quick question? I know the answer to this already, Piers. So, do they like file, returns and everything like this, or does the company like fold before it has to?
This is the interesting thing. Okay, this is the interesting thing, because I mean, one of the people who's involved in setting up the FCO Stratcom operation, he described it as one of the biggest Stratcom operations since the Cold War. And this is where you see, in a sense, the start of things such as the White Helmets, start of IncoStrat as well. And what you have is these organizations are set up, they're outsourced, they're contracted out, and they've got former people, arm's length from the British government, ex-military, James O'Meara, for example, the White Helmets, obviously, and so on. And yes, they're running companies, and they're bidding for contracts, and the money's going into the companies. And yes, they do file returns, and this is one of the ways you can track, and this is one of the ways that investigative journalists have tracked all the money going into these organizations, which is huge. The problem for this sort of mass contracting out of UK foreign policy is that it appears that some of these companies haven't filed returns when they should have filed returns. Auditors, that there was controversy over the White Helmets and Mayday Rescue, which was allegedly resolved, although some people question whether it was really properly resolved. And then, of course, with Syria, as I said, Olaf has investigated Syria. And you have a lot of questions being raised by quite a lot of people about what's going on. Are people being paid too much? Is there enrichment going on? And so on. And some of these companies, filing returns as they should, but then some sort of black holes in this, where you have companies set up which don't file returns. Mm-hmm. It looks to any outsider, the question which comes to mind is this really needs to be looked at very carefully. We have huge sums of money going into essentially, support for a contracted out FCO Stratcom operation in a major war, and you have sort of areas which are unclear. You have money, you have payments being made which are unclear, and then this issue I raised a while back about sort of some of the individuals connected with some of these processes setting up multiple companies, sometimes in multiple jurisdictions. And the question raised, well, what exactly is going on with this? And again, when you have sort of sometimes when things aren't returned, annual accounts aren't returned, that raises a big question.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it's not just sort of some people like Vanessa Beeley or some academics looking at. I mean, Olaf investigated Syria last year. There's a European fraud investigated body. And the same has happened with Mayday Rescue. They were investigating, and as you probably know, there was controversy over. And I think an FCO audit said it was all, the books are clean, but others have challenged that. So it's still controversial. You still have this lack of understanding and transparency about how this contracted out operation has been functioning, and with a lot of people asking some very big questions, but reasonable questions as well, right? We're talking about very large sums of public money going into an operation. That's before you even get to the point that, for me, the most important point is, one thing is how these things are administered, and is everything being done properly and so on, or is there being sort of exploitation and money being taken here and there? What is the purpose of this? Is to facilitate regime change.
That's it. At the end of the day, and why do we need regime change in Syria to keep us safe, Piers? The answer to that, of course, is we don't. The reason we're doing this is because we're America's puppy. We're America's lapdog, and we do whatever they tell us to. And that's the point. We're not over in Syria for anything to do with us at all. It's all to do with America and what they want. And that's why I'm pissed off with this, because it seems like we've got no sovereignty here. It seems like our sovereignty is over there. They're telling us what to do. I've just written a list here. This is just what I know, Piers, and just jotted down this morning. First of all, and this is what I'm going to be writing to the BBC and asking them, why have they ignored all of this? First of all, and glaringly to me, Riyam Dalati, this is BBC Syria. He was one of the top guys in Syria for the BBC, wasn't he, Riyam Dalati?
Well, he's a producer. He's been an important element in the BBC reporting from Syria, yes.
So they've ignored his
Not-
entire reporting, where he came out and blatantly on Twitter said the entire scene at the clinic that you saw the White Helmets film, that was the scene using open source. Remember, Theresa May said, and Bellingcat, that was what we used to justify bombing a sovereign country. That's what we used. And Riyam Dalati has said that the entire scene was fabricated. He said, if I remember right, he said the chemical weapons attack, or a chemical weapons attack, did take place.
No,
but everything else around it was.
He said an attack occurred.
An attack.
He's not being clear. He's not clear. He's not very clear about whether he means a chemical attack. Definitely.
So, but that plays into what the journalists reported, that there was an attack. Dust came up in the tunnels, and the kids were suffering from hypoxia. So that actually falls into the reporting that it wasn't a chemical weapons attack; it was just a normal a shelling.
Yeah.
But they've ignored all that. They've ignored his entire. That is one of their own reporters they've ignored there. They haven't even paid it any filter whatsoever. Not even brushed over it at all. Then they've ignored all the scientists. Ted Postel of the MIT, all the people, all the people who were saying. I remember watching one United Nations thing on this. I think it was at the Opcw. If I find the clip, I'll edit it in here. And the representative for America was smearing them at this meeting as some sort of Russian stooge. And the guy, I think it was Ted Postel, was like, answer your emails. I am not a stooge. I'm telling the truth. Answer your... And they were literally having an argument at this big Opcw thing, because she was just smearing and making up, so you've got all the experts. All of the experts have uncovered all of this. You've got, is it 4 whistleblowers now at the Opcw, or 5? Honestly, Piers, there's that many I've lost count. If you count Joseph Bastani, probably 5. Correct?
Well, there are 2 known whistleblowers. There are additional people who have communicated information out, and now with a statement of concern which has been issued by Hans von Swanich, Bastani, and Richard Falk, that has 4 former OPCW inspectors who are familiar with the issue are saying, yes, this needs to be looked at. So there are a lot of, as your point is, that there's a lot of sort of experts with knowledge close to the organisation, or in the organisation, who has spoken out.
And they've ignored all of them. They've ignored the WikiLeaks document that's on WikiLeaks right now that just says something totally different happened. And that was written by was it Henderson, the guy on the...
Yeah, I tell you what it is that they do. I mean, you're absolutely right. From the diplomats, from the top down, they smear. I've been smeared by a British diplomat in New York over Twitter. This is all they do. This is how they respond to anybody asking these questions. Well, this is just a Russian agenda. It might be a Russian agenda, but that's irrelevant to what the facts are on the ground. They smear. But what they don't do is they do not answer very clear, very precise questions. And starting with the first one, which is who changed the interim report secretly and then tried to publish it? And when that happened, why wasn't that investigated? Why is there somebody walking around the OPCW taking a report, modifying it, and then trying to publish it behind the back of the team? That's extraordinary. If you're in a company and the board signs off the annual accounts, and then somebody goes and changes them, massages them, and that's, you get into a lot of trouble.
Getting fired so hard.
So they're not, the point that they are not answering very clear questions which are being asked. And I tell you, I'll speculate why they're not answering those questions. Because they don't want the truth to come out.
Yeah, I mean, the testimony of 18 people at The Hague who were there in the video that the White Helmets actually filmed. I saw them with my own eyes, and they testified, no, we wasn't chlorine, we had dust. 18 people. I remember watching the guy from Channel 4 just saying, how can you do this? You're doing Putin's work. It was ridiculous. They've ignored any contrasting evidence whatsoever. They've ignored any reporting from the ground from people like Pearson Sharp and Vanessa Beeley. They've ignored it all. They don't question, they just smear whenever you ask these questions. So I'm going to ask the question, see if they smear me. Good luck with that. This doesn't look like at all an investigation to find out who perpetrated a chemical weapons attack. This looks like they're trying to cover up something else. And you mentioned Admiral C. Lord West there. I remember he was on the BBC at the time. I covered it in a video on my channel. He said that the only people, this isn't verbatim, but he was saying basically the only people who would actually benefit from a chemical weapons attack in Douma at that time were the terrorists. And the BBC reporter turned to him and said, it didn't say, is that, wow, that's incredible. She turned around and she said, aren't you in danger of muddying the waters here? Do you remember? Which to me said, well, muddying the waters. Institutions and authorities, including the OPC, they're lying about this. This is a massive deal. Let's just ask about the OPCW here. Doesn't this, just what we've uncovered, just the fact that there are massive questions to be answered here and they're not answering them at all, rather just smearing anybody asking them, doesn't that, A, call into question not everything that the OPCW has already reported, and remember, they've already said in the past that chemical weapons have occurred in Syria and what have you, but also any future things that they do, especially considering that since all this has happened, they can now assign blame, can't they? Doesn't it call into question all of this and basically make the OPCW's reporting, until they actually fess up and do some sort of proper investigation into this, just a joke and a laughingstock?
Well, the key point and the most important thing in what you just said is that this is not just to do with one chemical attack, as you said. This is to do with if there has been manipulation of the OPCW in this case.
How many more times has it happened?
How many times has this been going on? And I'm going to read from you now a communication from a senior OPCW official, which obviously I protect the identity, but I'm happy to sign affidavits and hand to a lawyer. And this is what this senior OPCW official states. Fortunately for me, my hands and my conscience are clean. My ethical behavior, which I made clear from day one at the OPCW, turned me into somebody not useful to the group. As a result, I was put aside from all matters related to the Syria investigations. How can one justify that? To exclude, redacted, me from the decision-making process and management of the most critical operations carried out. The Office of the Director General, as it were, the administrative office of the OPCW, was in charge of the Syrian missions from the moment the instrument was created. They took full control of it and were in control of every important decision made. And so what this OPCW official is describing is that the Syria investigations were controlled. They weren't controlled by the scientists. It was controlled from the cabinet office, the chief of cabinet and officer, top down, which is not how it's meant to be in the OPCW. Investigations are meant to be carried out under the heads of divisions and so on. And this person finishes in relation to whether any help can be given about this issue, and responds, I don't want to become involved. I don't want to expose myself and my family to their violence and revenge. I don't want to live in fear of crossing the street. And that's a senior OPCW official. Very, very clearly fearful of speaking out, but also very clearly making the point that you just made, is that you have a structure in the OPCW which has allowed clearly the French, UK and France, UK and the US to influence the output of those investigations. And going back to your point, this is incredibly dangerous because the OPCW can be used as a trigger mechanism for war. It could be used to find an allegation of an attack in Iran, and then you have potentially a war. This can lead to war. And this is why it's so important that the OPCW is absolutely independent. And it's very clear that it's not. This is a matter of, we should all be concerned about this, because this kind of thing can drag us into another war. This, of course, is why Bastani was thrown out for the Iraq invasion, because he wasn't saying, he wouldn't comply with American pressure over Iraq, and so they got him out and left the organization to get to where it is now. And this is, people should be shocked about this, and people should say, no, this isn't acceptable. And in terms of the statement of concern, which has been issued now by both Courage Foundation and something called the Berlin Group 21, do you know what's actually being asked for, and what the OPCW scientists, the only thing they've asked for since the very beginning of the controversy was, we want to be able to sit down in an open forum with all the scientists so that we can discuss properly the evidence and how it was collated, and then lay the basis for a proper investigation. But in the first step, they're just asking to meet and to sit down. And the OPCW has said no, 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 and then started to smear. And that, to me, if you allow me to kind of speculate, that means that they're trying to hide something. They won't even respond to the most reasonable request that two very experienced scientists can, with the rest of the team, who let sit down and talk about the findings. They won't even allow that because they've got something to hide. And it's a very big thing.
I worry that this is some sort of Mockingbird 2.0 operation. You know, people who are listening who won't know, Operation Mockingbird was Bill Casey, who was head of the CIA in 1981. His first meeting with Ronald Reagan, who had just been elected. Ronald Reagan went around the desk to his heads of sections and said, "What have you learned in your first couple of months in the job since I've taken over?" And it was his first round table meeting. And Bill Casey said, "Well, the thing that we've learned at the CIA, and what I've learned the most, is that most of our information comes from open sources, comes from the news. And so wouldn't it be great if we could control the news?" And they had a conversation about it, and Ronald Reagan said to him, asked him the question, and this is confirmed from two sources, one of which is Barbara Honegger, who was a staffer at the time, said, how will you know, Bill, when your operation is complete? And he said the famous line, "Now we will know our propaganda campaign is complete when everything the American public believe is false." Now, it seems to me like that they said they wound that up, but I wonder whether they've taken it to the next level. And I'm not just talking about putting people who are friendly to them in the media, but also in positions of power, such as, heads of, I don't know, universities and doctors and, professors and scientists and lawyers. You see what I mean, don't you, Piers? This is really worrying. And it's worrying for me right now. I don't know about you, and I want to end on this. If there's anything else you want to cover, we'll cover it. But I want to end on this, that this is eroding public trust in institutions and authorities, which are massive. We should trust the OPCW implicitly. Implicitly. There can be no question when it comes to the OPCW. And right now, I have massive amounts of evidence, and you have it too, that they are refusing to answer and refusing to refute, that says that they are all lying bastards and we shouldn't trust them. Right at the point where these same institutions and authorities are saying, "Come here, let me jab this in your arm, it'll be totally safe." And they're wondering right now, why don't people trust the vaccine? No, you idiots. People go on holiday and take a vaccine, no problem when it comes to going on holiday, malaria and what have you. People don't have problems with vaccines. Some people do. It's not that we don't trust a vaccine. We don't trust you. And this is the thing that worries me, because this erosion of trust, and because we're in the information age that we are now, and people are, this information is available to us, whereas maybe when 9/11 happened, it wasn't, because the internet was still in its infancy back then. But this wealth of information, it's blowing holes all over the place, and it's highlighting them all as liars. Right at the point where they're saying, you need to trust us. We're not lying to you this time. And that, I think, is the thing that really worries me, Piers, because once that happens, the fabric of society is just going to fall apart, isn't it? And anarchy is going to resume.
Yeah, I agree entirely. The loss of trust in multiple institutions, media, academia, OPCW, etc. Of course, this is not because people have become distrusting. This is because these institutions themselves have failed. They have failed. They failed in Iraq. They've failed across the board, time and time again. we in the liberal democracies that we live in, our institutions have become effectively corrupted or hollowed out. Academia is not properly independent. The mass media is not properly independent. Parliament does not function in any meaningful sense. The difficulties I've had in, on any issue, getting parliamentarians to do the smallest things. Well, we're not sure we can do this. We're not sure we can do that. Well, that's it. We do not have robust, independent, strong, powerful institutions in Western liberal democracies. And we need somehow in the coming years, with the engagement of the people, of all of us, to try to rebuild those institutions as properly independent so that we can then start to trust them again. Because obviously, as you say, that the hollowing out, the lack of independence means that we can't trust them, and their track record tells us that we can't trust them.
We'd be stupid to.
We need to build. Yeah. And this will take, as we've discussed before, this is going to take people, all of us, trying together to work to mobilize and engage, and then to, get back our democracy, get back our institutions, get back our universities, so that when we go to university, our kids will have a proper education. The mass media, so that get the mass media to a point where at least you can watch, you can think, well, you're going to get at least both sides of the discussion kind of thing, rather than at the moment where the mass media is terribly close to political power. But we need to get that back. We've lost all of that in a big way, and as you say, it's terrifying potentially.
It really is. It's got to a point now where I think we've gone so far, and they've gone so far in trying to prove their narrative. They've crossed over a line. They're looking behind them now, and the line is a dot to them, and it's almost like they can't pull back because they're in too deep now. I keep thinking about this, Piers, and I keep thinking what we need is a South Africa moment. We need some sort of like, okay, shit's gone on in the past. Can we just have a conversation about it? And let's not start assigning blame. Let's not worry about assigning blame. Let's just say, okay, no, there won't be any, nobody's going to go to prison. Nobody's going to prison anyway. Can we just know what the truth is, please? So we can start trusting people again and trusting our institutions and authorities, because right now we don't. And, it seems to me, at least, rather than have any conversations about anything, Piers, right now, instead, they want to silence people and move them to the boundaries if they're not speaking the right language. And that's really worrying to me, because, well, I mean, what kind of society is that, where if you say the wrong thing, you're cast to the shadows and the outsides and what have you? And those are the people that historically have told us the truth as well, that are being cast out. And pretty soon you get to a situation where nobody knows what's going on at all.
Yeah.
We need to come clean about this. Unless there is some sort of self-reflection in the media and the authorities and the institutions as well, and unless there's some sort of self-reflection where they can say, listen, we've done some stuff in the past, it's really bad. This is what we've done, but this is why we've done it, and this is why what the extenuating circumstances. And we need to start having that conversation, because until that we do, they're just going to keep smearing us, and we're going to start backing off more and more until the point where nobody trusts them on anything that they say. And let's face it, we're not far off that, especially with the BBC already, are we?
Well, I think we're kind of like there. I mean, I remember I remember reading a book about deception in politics and so on. And the argument was that, deception is a necessary part of politics sometimes, and especially in international, sometimes it's needed, necessary, et cetera, But it said that the problem is, if you start to do too much of it, you start to erode, as you just pointed out, erode the trust. So, it may be that occasionally deception is necessary, but and I think what we have at the moment is the deception levels are up here. Yeah. You have so much of it. The damage this is doing, as you say, to our fabric of society and people's sense of trust is of epic proportions. And at some point, as you said, there'll be a moment here where this all just stops, where enough people have said, right, we're not being told the truth, and so on.
Well, it's weakening the country, Piers, because it's weakening the country. I mean, I don't know what your views are on the virus. We don't really want to go into that, but I do know I do know that right now they've got a real problem with Black and Asian and ethnic minorities taking up the vaccine because, like I said, it's not that they don't trust the vaccine; they don't trust you, they don't trust them. And Lenny Henry's just released an advert on it, just trying to boost confidence in it. And he said this, quote, "You have legitimate worries and concerns, and we hear that. We know change needs to happen and that it's hard to trust some institutions and authorities." And he's right with that. I think you will agree. But he never in that advert goes on to explain why we don't trust our institutions and authorities. And I think it's possibly because he would have had to say, I know we've lied to you constantly, and the people who gave me a knighthood have lied to you constantly your entire lives. But honestly, they're telling the truth now. It's the boy who cried wolf, and they're at fault here, not us.
Yeah, I think that the most important thing to keep in mind, because governments and elites will always try and blame us, the people, for all of this. They will always do it instinctively. But the question of loss of trust in authorities, the authorities have themselves to blame and only themselves to blame. They have, as you know and I know, we've lived through things such as Iraq and many other things, and we've seen it time and time again. They only have themselves to blame. They are the root cause of if the public doesn't trust them, it's because they've been lying and they've been found out. And the responsibility lies with them ultimately. Well, but it's a bigger thing. It's a bigger thing, as I say, and as I know we discussed before. We're at a point where we need a real reinvigoration of democracy, and that'll only come through people. I think people's movement or some kind of political organisation which starts to shake up the existing party structure, but which also is guided by a principle of we need to restore the independence of our various institutions, get the media working in a way that it should, get Parliament working in the way that it should. And this is going to take years, right? It's going to take, it'll be the rest of our lives, I'm sure, will be involved in trying to do this. It'll keep us busy kind of thing, but that's what's necessary now. No, and the alternative is, as you've pointed out, increasing distrust, dissent, and chaos potentially. I guess at the end of the day, can't go on forever. What's the status quo? That's for sure.
It can't. What we need is a debate. We need more open debate. We need
people to be able to talk and not be smeared.
Yeah, we need more.
Right?
We need that. We need debate rather than people being pushed to the sides and just silenced and smeared like you guys are. The work you've done is extensive, and I've covered it extensively on my channel. I'm really pleased that you've done it, because without it, we might believe something that isn't true. Is there anything you need to say, Doc, while you're here?
No, it was great to see you again.
Likewise.
It's been a long year since. It was Sid Cup, wasn't it? Do you remember?
Sorry?
We met in Sid Cup, didn't we? Do you remember?
Yeah. Oh no, we did a brilliant interview, and I didn't turn the camera on. So I had to do it like this. Thanks for reminding me of that. I did record this one this time, so you'll be happy to know.
No, I can see it says recording up there. But no, it's good to see you again, and keep up the good work, and hopefully we'll be able to see each other in the